Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming at you again live from Film Fanatic headquarters here in the massive city of Northport, Maine. So, hope everyone's doing good. It is about 10 o'clock on another wintry morning. So, yeah, I really want I usually always like to start by thanking all the great folks out there in the YouTube world and other film fanatic oriented people who are at the end of the day, I guess other they're of this cut from the same cloth like I am. We all love movies, and they're kind of part of us. They're definitely a integral part of who we are, what we love, and for me, I've always said it goes beyond just it's like the entertainment value. You have folks that you know I think everybody across the board, really any people from all walks of life all love movies to a degree, and within that, there's obviously various degrees that you know of how they watch movies or particular genres that they gravitate towards, or maybe how frequently they watch movies. But movies, and the magic of motion pictures is just like that's it's. I feel like it's so part of our DNA. I have a couple of friends that watch movies. They like movies quite a bit, but they usually don't watch movies by themselves. They don't really go to the theater very much. They look at it, or if they do go to the theater, they'll typically watch movies with their kids or to family. It's centered on a family kind of gathering. And then you have people too who have a real reservation towards certain kinds of genres. You have people who might not like horror like what I do, and which is one of the main subjects I talk about. One of my favorite genre, and they might have you know a certain kind of reservation or kind of a wall against it, and that's fine. People have all of their. It's great that everybody has their own opinions and all of those things. But again, I think movies across the board in general like have a real deep impact. Everybody, whether they're a fellow film fanatic or not, they all have some kind of memory. You know, Mostly in that case, some kind of sense of nostalgic connection to a certain movie, or whatnot that they've grown up watching, or that they have some kind of a deep memory connected to it, so it brings them back. Movies that I think do that for people, movies that are very popular, but they're great movies. I think movies like The Breakfast Club, across the board, people have some kind of connection to that, whether they're a real deep lover of film or not. And other movies like, say, I don't know, like Top Gun. Like those are movies that are very, very popular in pop culture, and they have a really broad appeal. And I love those movies, particularly The Breakfast Club. The so It's the power of cinema, even from looking at it from kind of the full spectrum. And for me, it's a real deep thing for me. It's beyond just like, I look at it, and the way I appreciate movies, it's more than just you know a form of entertainment. Obviously, it's mainly that, but it goes beyond that. It really influences movies. Really, are a huge personal inspiration for me. I always I've always been really influenced by films, and I've always been really fascinated by the aesthetics around films and the art that's put into it. And like I've talked about many, many times, it's grown so much over the years as a big influence, particularly around the music that I write for my band Quantum, that it's kind of the number one inspiration, films and all things around that. And I've said it before, but the movies that are the most influential on that band or on my band Quantum, is easily Alien, Ridley Scott's masterpiece from 1979. Blade Runner, another amazing film directed also by Ridley Scott. Tourist Trap, which is one of probably my all-time favorite. Grindhouse, low budget, very low. It's a very low budget exploitation movie. That's probably my favorite in that genre. And also probably the biggest influence on me as far as a movie that has like probably inspired me more than any other movie is definitely Texas Chainsaw Massacre, as well as Friday 13th, that whole franchise, and Halloween. Those all of those movies are probably the most influential on me as far as what I do with my weird and wacky band Quantum. But the main inspiration for that group is definitely Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I think the music that I've written for that band and that I continue to write, and just everything around that band. If it wasn't for that movie, the original one in particularly, directed by Tobe Hooper in 1974, I think the band would be very different. I think it would be, it would obviously still be, inspired by themes and aesthetics around film and all of those kinds of things. Because again, that's a short list, and it's roughly about five or six movies that I can just name, right off the top of my head that are massive influences. But being the focus, well, especially today's show on Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the that movie without a doubt is the biggest influence. Everything from the music from the original movie, the whole kind of world that Tobe Hooper created, the kind of the murky, dark, raw, deranged kind of atmosphere, and especially the aesthetics around Leatherface. I try to always, I've always tried to incorporate some kind of theatrical flair with that band, in particular with examples like where I use masks and wigs and try to create an interesting space or something that maybe stands out from other groups, or even if maybe people don't necessarily dig the music or they think it's strange, they might at least, and it might not be their cup of tea, but it will at least make the visual thing will maybe give people a memory of it, or that will be something that they'll think about, even if the music isn't their whole their cup of tea, which is a thing that we run into with the band, because on I think it's got elements that have a pretty good appeal for people, and I attribute that to having influences that are not necessarily electronic music. I really, when I'm composing that music and when I'm thinking about it, and when I'm trying to create some new ideas, or I come across some new ideas, I always try to focus on the melody. Whatever tunes we have or whatever we're doing, I always feel like the melody is key. And if I have a melody and something that appeals to your ears or appeals to my ears that is maybe to a degree acts as like a hook or it's catchy. That's usually the starting point, and usually when that comes, when something like that comes across to me when I'm trying to discover some new ideas or I come across new ideas, usually that's like the base. That's the starting point, and and then once I have that, I try to really focus on that. I got that whole idea from Mike Whitehead, who plays bass in Quantum and also is a big time contributor and definitely my partner in crime. I couldn't do any of this craziness without him. And we've been working together for a very long time. And he comes from a very different world. He comes from the jazz world. He's primarily a trumpet player. He plays bass in Quantum, but his background is in the jazz world. And I remember, when a few years after we started the band, he always felt like when it came to writing and getting creative, he always looked at the starting point as, he would always say to me, well, melody is key. If you have the melody and you have something that's, has that hook or, has something that has that melodic appeal, that's the starting point. And that's where, if you have something like that within the context of the song is centered on that. And usually, if you focus on that and build it outwards, then you'll have a song. But if you don't have a real strong melody, it can be interesting, And I used to approach music where, obviously, because I mostly play drums and have messed around with other instruments, play a little bit of guitar and a little bit of keyboards. I usually, especially in the early phases of that band, I would approach everything from a rhythmic standpoint, which can be cool and fun. But it was always, after a while, I realized that's kind of a secondary approach where I feel the melody, after listening to his advice and trying to think about that concept, after, realizing that the melody is really, at least how my approach is, at the top of the tier. That's like the number one. And once I kind of switched that around and started thinking about things in terms of just melody, things became better and a little bit easier to write music. And it was a lot easier to, hopefully write music where each song had its own personality. And but also, I attribute the some of the appeal to the music because we try to incorporate. I love all kinds of music, and a lot of jazz. Like jazz has been a really big influence on our group and a lot of the music I write. A lot of stuff from the '50s and '60s, and a lot of Miles Davis, a lot of the later electric, when Miles went electric, a lot of that stuff. The fusion stuff is a real big influence. Um, Stuff that came out in the '70s. Herbie Hancock, Herbie Hancock and the Headhunters, Thrust being my favorite album of all time. So that whole jazz thing, from like the more straight ahead jazz to the fusion to the electronica vibe, especially what Herbie was doing back then, all of that stuff is a tremendous influence. And that later Herbie stuff, I kind of look at that as more definitely jazz and fusion based, but it's definitely, to me, has it's very much for me personally a big influence for a lot of electronic music that I love. And I feel like he was doing all of this amazing work with synths that was that was way ahead of its time. But so we try to incorporate a lot of things that are quote unquote non-electronic, and then also the rock and the punk thing. But there are aspects of our music that I know are on the fringe side of things. I like music that's also, very much on the outskirts of what traditional music is. Groups like Suicide, which was an early electronic duo that I feel were one of the greatest, you know, two of the greatest artists ever to grace, our planet. Really raw punk rock fueled, really intense electronic music, but they always had some kind of melody, but it was very fringy, very much on the fringe. It had a real noisy, kind of harsh vibe to it. And then I also love stuff that's like quote unquote, more noise based stuff. Groups like Pharmacon, who is a this girl who puts out this incredibly harsh and dark uh, music that I think for some people it would require you to be in a certain kind of mood. But it's very much, to a degree, almost anti-music, in the traditional sense. And then other groups that really take that thing to an extreme. Groups like Wapstan, who's a group, an electronic group from from Montreal, Canada. They have a very harsh kind of noise aesthetic, but I really love their stuff. So we have lots of different influences, and I know some of those aspects can be very polarizing for people and maybe turn people off. But I try to always have melody too, so I kind of go back and forth. But with Texas, as far as obviously the soundtrack from the original is such a huge influence on me. The whole world that whole movie created, and with the use of masks, all that stuff is directly taken from Leatherface. The main character, the iconic monster from the film. So I did a show yesterday where I talked about Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part Two, starring Bill Moseley, and Dennis, and also Dennis Hopper. I so love that movie, and I think it's one of the greatest like horror sequels ever. A very polarizing movie. Some people really like it. Some people really hate it, and it's because I think it's all due to the how incredibly different it is. It's essentially like a black comedy. But that movie, I just love it. I just love that movie to death. I'm part of the camp of people who I'm on the side of people who really, really love that movie, and that it is tonally such a different movie. So I did a video on that movie yesterday, and I keep bringing it up in various videos. I reference it a lot, and that I've been wanting to get to it. And so today I'm going to do a show on it, and that is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake. This came out in 2003. It was directed by Marcus Nispel, starring Jessica Biel. I have a really funny history with this movie. It's been out for a long time. It came out in 2003, and my opinions of this movie have changed so much over the years. Yeah, it's been definitely one of those examples of a film that I generally didn't really like that much when I first saw it, and I don't know, I had these weird hang-ups about it. And over time, and this movie's been out, since 2003, so, a long time now at this point. And over time, this has grown to be one of my favorite movies, and especially one of my favorite, quote unquote remakes. Even though I feel like it's very different in a lot of ways, and it's kind of its own separate kind of thing. But this movie has like really grown on me, and now I love this movie. I think it's one of the best kind of reimagining of a classic horror movie. I look at Texas, the original Texas, as being kind of like sacred ground. I feel like that movie is such a movie that I put on such a high pedestal. I think it's easily one of the most influential horror movies of all time, and I think it is so influential that it even kind of steps out of just being, say, a horror film. I mean, Ridley Scott, for instance, when he directed Alien, and that is definitely a horror movie, but it's a sci-fi movie, and it's a very different thing. It has a very high budget. It's a very big budget. It's still got a real grittiness to it, but he's Ridley Scott is notorious for saying in all kinds of interviews over the years that Texas Chainsaw Massacre, is the original was one of the biggest influences, if not the biggest influence on him for that film. And he always regarded it as, it's a straight ahead story, but essentially he wanted it to be, like truckers in space, that the old dark house kind of story. And he based, that movie and the use of how he uses the characters and the narrative of the story. He based it on Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which at the core of the original, it's like that classic story, the old dark house, but it's centered on these five people, five characters that are put into this situation of where they don't have any control and they're put in this environment. And also he took a lot from Texas, as far as the rawness of it and the kind of the primal concepts that movie really plays with, and where it really can really get under your skin. And so Ridley Scott's talked about the original Texas as being one of the biggest influences, if not, he in a lot of ways he modeled it off of Texas for what he did with Alien, which is just such a masterpiece. And it's so the history I had with this film, with this remake is really weird and strange to a degree. I I didn't see this movie. I mean, it came out in 2003, so quite a few years ago. It's hard to believe it's like almost 20 years. Um, I saw it. I saw it maybe 3 or 4 years after it came out. I think I rented it on DVD, and I went into it having this whole thing of a lot of reluctancy, where I was like, how can they remake this movie? At that time, I really was down. I wasn't really down with the idea. It was, in the early 2000, period, there was a whole series of a lot of horror remakes that were coming out. That's a thing that's happened a lot, especially the last 10 years, 15 years. A lot of remakes, a lot of reboots. That kind of concept has kind of always been around, but it's been a thing now where it's a regular practice in the film industry. I mean, there's so many movies that have been remade or retold, or there's prequels to a certain storyline. Everything from movies like Child's Play with Chucky. That's been remade. There's also been The Last House on the Left. There was a remake of that. I did a show on the original. There's been a remake of Evil Dead, the classic from Sam Raimi. My Bloody Valentine. So many movies, so many movies. It's like it's an endless list, and that's part of the thing about where the trend has been in Hollywood for a long time now, to really for these studios to essentially take on a movie that was, more or less a real low budget horror film or even an exploitation film, and to like suddenly give it this big budget treatment and remake it and try to make it into this cash cow and then milk it for all it's worth. And I find too, it's most of the time it's not that successful. There are exceptions, but I find a lot of the times it's kind of disappointing. Movies that I think where it's been really successful, I think, case in point, the topic of today's show, this Texas Chainsaw remake, I think is one of the best versions of that being successful. The other movie I think is really really good and just awesome is the remake of Evil Dead, the classic film by Sam Raimi. I think the remake of that is so awesome and original. And eventually I'll do a show on that, as well as the original franchise. Just the iconic franchise that it is. Another movie that I think is really, really good is also there was a really wonderful, which I think is one of the best vampire movies of all time, and it came out in I think in the late '90s, maybe early 2000s. But this Swedish film called Let the Right One In, which is I think one of the greatest vampire movies ever. It's just amazing, and the atmosphere is just so incredible. There was a remake of that film that came out quite a few years after that, an American version called Let Me In, which was directed by Matt Reeves, who just recently, last year, did the Batman remake or the new Batman with Robert Pattinson, which I did a show on that, which I really love Matt Reeves as a director. I think he's one of the greatest directors around. And that Batman with Robert Pattinson is overall my favorite incarnation of that character. And Matt Reeves is at a really interesting place because he can do things, where he can do essentially these remakes, but he'll give it this new life and he'll give it a totally like a totally fresh kind of presentation. And I think he also does original films, but he's a really unique director because he does these remakes. Essentially, they're remakes, but he's so successful at it, and they're all like they're standalone movies, and they're all based on these like classic movies. Say Batman. I mean, there's countless incarnations. There's countless Batman movies. Christopher Nolan, probably one of the greatest, obviously with his work. And then Matt Reeves, like what he did with the Planet of the Apes movies. Those are just incredible movies based on the original sci-fi sci-fi series that is, amazing. Iconic. Those are movies I'll eventually get to also. But what he did with Planet of the Apes, just incredible. Totally new and fresh and unique, and just giving you something new, but still paying tribute or homage to the original. Just tremendous. And so I think he's in a rare place as a director because he can really tackle those kinds of extraordinary. Well, it's such a. I look at that too as just being a monumental task to do a remake of a film that is really beloved, but do it justice and make it, and try to put it in a space of where it's its own, standalone movie. Like that's a really ambitious thing to do. A lot of the times that doesn't happen well at all. I think movies that where it fails miserably, films like The Last House on the Left remake, it's really terrible, and that's based again on one of the greatest movies ever, directed by Wes Craven. The Hills Have Eyes, another Wes Craven classic. That was really terrible. RoboCop, I think is another example. It's got moments of where it's really, really okay, pretty decent, but it's essentially a really watered down, bastardized version of it. You know, when you look at the classic original, Total Recall is another one. Really watered down and sanitized. There's been a lot of movies like that have been really bad. I think it's happened in the world of Superman with a lot of the Superman movies, especially the Man of Steel, uh, movie that came out about essentially the remake of Superman. Certain things about that film are really great, but it always makes me want to watch the original Christopher Reeves movies and some of the other ones that came out. Uh, Even the remake with Superman Returns with Brandon Ruth, which I think is a pretty underrated movie, and I actually think it's a really great movie. But so there's I think there's more examples of where that the remake concept or that idea is there's more examples of where it's not successful and it does fail badly. And that's just my personal opinion, but I think the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake is an example of one of the greatest um, examples of it being really, really successful. And when I first saw this, again, I saw it about 3 or 4 years after it came out, and I don't know, I didn't really like it. I thought it was kind of my first impression was I thought it was kind of a ham-handed version of the film. At first, because Texas means so much to me, and part two, I always was like, oh, how can they do it? I had these reservations going into it, and it stuck with me the whole time. And I'm like, at the end of it, I was just like wanting to watch the original again. I thought it was initially my first impression was I thought it it tried to take it tried to do away with the concept of some of the strengths that made the original so great, where the first Texas always gets this bad rap of being essentially a really gory slasher film. But whenever you watch that film, and whenever I watch that film to this day, compared to really any other horror movies that were out when that came out, and especially now, it doesn't have very much gore. It really is, to me, a psychological. It's more of a psychological experience than anything else, where less is more, and it's the atmosphere that pulls you in and really, I think, frightens the viewer, and it does for me. But it doesn't really show much gore. It doesn't really have all that much violence. It's more of a psychological journey. And I always thought because it has some restraint, and obviously Toby Hooper had a lot of restraints around him because of the lack of budget for that film. But because he also shot the film where he didn't necessarily show copious amounts of violence, but it was all focused on the psychological aspects, I always felt I've always been a big fan of like the whole kind of less is more concept when it comes to films. And a lot of the times, what you don't see is is that much more frightening. And I thought my first reaction with the new Texas was that it opened that door, and suddenly it was ignoring that kind of narrative, and this movie was concentrated on showing everything and being as gory and being as over the top as it could be, and it didn't have that suspense. It didn't leave any room for your imagination, especially somebody who loves the original so much. So I don't know, I kind of dismissed it for a while, and then a few years after that, maybe another handful of years, I saw it again, and I kind of felt the same way. I was like, yeah, it's okay. It's okay. I didn't think it was a terrible movie. It grew on me a little bit. And then fast forward a few more years later, and as a whole, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise, I'm not a huge fan of. My favorites have always been obviously the first one and the second one, but there's a whole bunch of other movies in the franchise that I'm not really a big fan of, and I feel like they're all a mess in a lot of ways, and I can't really watch them. So fast forward quite a few years later, and a couple of guys that I like on YouTube were talking about this movie, and we have a lot of the same tastes. And I had not seen the remake in a while, and they were talking about how they felt that this movie was, at the end of the day, one of the best examples of a really successful remake. So I decided to give it a chance. So I went and I bought it. I actually bought it, and I hadn't seen it in probably 5 years or so. And I was at Goodwill in Belfast, and I bought it on DVD. I bought this very copy. And then I watched it, and I was totally blown away. I was like, no, for some reason, after all that time went by, I went into the movie watching it without any reservations. I went into it totally cold, not thinking, okay, you got to prove this, you got to prove it to me, kind of thing. And that happens sometimes when you like hold tight on to things. You build up a wall, and you can't separate yourself from that. And sometimes that's a good thing, but a lot of times it's too negative, because it can cloud your judgment. And I felt like that, looking back, that was the problem I was having around this film. So I had, a lot of problems with it. But then I saw it after a long time went by. I bought it. I bought it on DVD. I bought this copy of it on DVD for really, really cheap, for $2. It's a really great edition. I don't have this on Blu-ray, but I definitely want to get it on Blu-ray, and it has a bunch of special features. It's actually a really great quality DVD. And I watched it totally cold without any, hang-ups or reservations. And I've seen it a couple times, and I was like, this movie is badass. Like, it's legitimately badass. And then after I had that experience, I thought to myself, what the fuck was I thinking? Like, this movie is great. Like, it's I think it's truly a standalone movie. It has a lot of the great attributes of what I love about the original. It's super gritty, it's super dirty. Obviously, it's a bigger budget. There's a bigger budget behind the film, but it still retains that super rawness of the original, which I really love. Uh, and I think is really the crown achievement of that movie. It's a great balance of where obviously it's a bigger budget. It has a bigger, much bigger budget to it, and it's a more or less a big Hollywood studio version of it of Texas. But they had this great balance of where Marcus Nispel really had this great balance of still making it feel like a guerrilla, like a movie that was made kind of in this guerrilla style world of filmmaking, but yet it's a big budget film, and it retains that super rawness of the original, where it feels like it's still a documentary. That's the thing that I love so much about the original Texas is that it never, and I've seen that movie so many freaking times I can't even count. But for me, it doesn't really feel like a movie. It feels like I'm watching a documentary, and that's the thing that I love about Texas. And I feel like the newer one has that vibe with a bigger budget, but it still has that rawness to it. And it was a great balance. And I totally love this movie. And the other thing that's so cool about this film is that Marcus Nispel brought back Daniel Pearl, who was the cinematographer on the original, and he shot this film, and it really is, you know, it, all the scenes are just beautiful to look at. Like it really has that vibe to it. And then the other thing that's so cool is like the original has the notorious voiceover by John Larroquette, the introduction to the whole story. They brought back John Larroquette, and he also does the voiceover narration on this, which is so awesome. And the other thing about it is the story is very different. It's definitely centered on the family and also the farm, and it obviously centered, the location is still in Texas, but it's very different. The structure of the story is quite a bit different. And again, it pays homage to the original, but the structure is very, very different. The characters are really great. It's definitely gory, and it's more on the gore side of things than the original, but it still retains and still has that real psychological kind of blackout aspect of the film where it's really intense on your brain, and it just creates this world of insanity that you feel like you're being pulled into. And so this movie really strikes all of those chords so well. And now this movie is like one of my favorite remakes. This and the Evil Dead remake I think are the best examples of uh, it being done. The art of the remake. The two best examples of you know of that being successful. And I truly love this movie now. I think it's one of the best. It's my third favorite in the franchise. And again, there's a lot of movies in the franchise of Texas, and I'm not a really big fan of most of the other films. They're okay at moments, but I think they're generally pretty disposable and forgettable. And there's quite a few films, but this is just amazing. I highly recommend it. When I came around to this movie, I was like, "What the hell am I thinking?" Like this, or what was I thinking? This movie is awesome, and I think this movie is really great because you could go into watching this not knowing anything about what Texas Chainsaw Massacre was about, or even even having to have seen the first one. You could go into it totally cold, and I think the strength of this movie is that it's unique enough that it's its own film and it's a standalone film. So it puts it in a unique light, and so yeah, this movie is super awesome. I really love it, and I'm really looking forward to buying this on Blu-ray at some point. It's a great example of how all the right chords were played to make this movie successful. It was a great balance of how you could take a real complicated idea, but yet have all everything, have all the stars aligned, and make it really successful. Marcus Nispel too. He's actually a really good director. He actually did the same thing for Friday 13th with which was the last Friday 13th movie that came out, and which essentially is kind of the same thing to a degree. It's a bigger budget film, but still has a rawness to it, and I actually really love that movie too. So he's kind of similar to a degree like Matt Reeves, who I mentioned before. Kind of does this unique thing, but is very successful as far as doing remakes. And it's a rare thing, but he's got a pretty good track record. And especially with this one, this is an awesome movie. It's now grown to be one of my favorite remakes. And I even use that term remake more and more loosely. It's evolved to where I feel like it's a standalone movie, and it's just a damn good movie. So definitely check this out. Looking forward to buying this on Blu-ray at some point. Great stuff. Great stuff. So this is Jason Dean, Film Fanatic. So I appreciate everybody checking out this channel. And if you like these wacky videos, please like and subscribe, and keep the conversations coming. Really appreciate the love. And we will see you next time. Peace.